On January 8, 2026, less than 3 weeks before the Australian Open, world number one Aryna Sabalenka walked into a routine press conference in Brisbane and detonated a bomb under the WTA calendar. She did not just complain about being tired or mention a long season in passing. She called the 2026 Women's Tour insane, said the mandatory rules were unreasonable, and calmly announced that she would rather be fined than keep sacrificing her body to a system that claims to protect player welfare while punishing anyone who actually tries to look after their health. The receipts were there for everyone to see. A few hours earlier, Sabalenka had won in straight sets at the Brisbane International, an early season WTA 500 she was using to tune up for the Australian Open. The world number one had just done what the tour asks of its stars at the start of every year: show up early, draw TV audiences, sell tickets. But when reporters asked if she would keep adding more tournaments to maintain her ranking, she drew a line. She said the season was definitely insane, pointed directly to injuries across the locker room, and warned that skipping WTA 1000 events to protect herself would trigger automatic fines and point penalties from the very organization that constantly posts about player welfare on social media. That is the contradiction at the heart of this investigation. On one side, a WTA marketing machine that talks about mental health campaigns, recovery content, and wellness partnerships. On the other, a rulebook that demands its biggest stars enter an 11-month grind of mandatory tournaments, then quietly docks them ranking points or slaps them with financial penalties when their bodies finally say no. Sabalenka's January tirade did not appear out of thin air. It was the latest flashpoint in a fight that has stretched from Iga Swiatek's exhausted press conferences to the PTPA's antitrust lawsuit to a growing split between how the women's and men's tours are handling the pressure from their own stars to step off the treadmill. To understand why Aryna Sabalenka chose this moment to publicly defy the WTA's own system, you have to understand the player the tour has built itself around. Since 2023, Sabalenka has been one of the defining forces in women's tennis, piling up major titles and deep runs that kept her in the top 2 of the rankings for multiple seasons. She is the kind of aggressive, charismatic, big-hitting champion every tour wants at the center of its product. That success, however, came with a price. In 2025, she admitted that she played several tournaments while sick or really exhausted from overplaying, a phrase that hits very differently when you look at the demands built into the calendar she was forced to follow. According to the WTA's 2026 official rulebook, top players who qualify as commitment players are required to compete in 4 Grand Slams, all of the WTA 1000 mandatory events on the schedule, and a set number of WTA 500 commitment tournaments, subject only to specific carve-outs such as age eligibility, years of service, and long-term injury exemptions. If a player who is 18 or older fails to play a WTA 1000 mandatory commitment event without a covered excuse, the rules state that she will receive a 0-point result for that event in her rankings, and repeated failures can trigger further fines and sanctions. On paper, it looks like structure. In practice, it functions as a trap. The more successful you are, the more tournaments you are compelled to play just to avoid being punished. The system doesn't just lean on athletes through the calendar, it invades their rankings as well. A player who skips a mandatory 1000 event to heal a chronic shoulder or rest from a heavy run is not merely missing the chance to gain points. The rulebook actively installs a 0 in her ranking breakdown. Over a season, those zeros add up, reshaping seedings, reducing prize money opportunities, and making it harder to qualify for year-end championships. That is why Sabalenka's January comments hit such a nerve. She said out loud that she expects to be fined again if she dares to skip events in 2026, and she framed that choice not as a tantrum, but as a defensive measure to protect her health after an already brutal 2025 season. Aryna Sabalenka is not alone in this. Iga Swiatek, the 5-time major champion who became the face of women's tennis before Sabalenka overtook her in the rankings, has been complaining about the length and intensity of the season for years. At the Miami Open, Swiatek backed the Professional Tennis Players Association's lawsuit and called playing for 11 months pretty crazy, saying that an 11-month season is unnecessary and too much, and that both players and fans would benefit from a shorter, more coherent calendar. She's talked about dividing the year into phases just to cope with the pressure of almost continuous competition. When the player who once dominated the tour is openly saying she barely has an off-season, it becomes difficult to claim that the system is working as designed. The PTPA's legal action adds another layer to this story. In 2025, the group co-founded by Novak Djokovic filed an antitrust lawsuit against the ATP and WTA, alleging that the tours use penalties such as fines and ranking point deductions to lock players into their ecosystems and restrict them from earning outside income in competing events. The suit specifically points to how mandatory participation rules and point penalties were used in a system that contributed to Swiatek losing the #1 ranking to Sabalenka with little notice, arguing that players who withdraw or fail to enter certain events are punished in ways that go beyond legitimate sporting regulation and veer into anti-competitive behavior. In other words, what Sabalenka framed as insane doesn't just feel unfair, it might be legally questionable as well. All of this exists against the backdrop of a WTA trying to present itself as a modern, athlete-first organization. WTA communications emphasize mental health initiatives, injury awareness, and the importance of rest and recovery. Yet, the 2026 rulebook still defines a rigid player commitment structure where Grand Slams, mandatory 1000s, and designated 500 events stack together into an almost year-long obligation. Age and long-term injury carve-outs are narrow and bureaucratic, and the integrity rules that govern suspensions operate concurrently with these commitments, meaning that a player can be blocked from entering some events while still carrying 0-point punishments for commitments she cannot realistically fulfill. It's a system where welfare language sits on top of hard enforcement. That brings us back to what happened in Brisbane. Sabalenka did not threaten to quit or start a boycott on camera, but the implication was clear. She would selectively skip tournaments, including some high-level events, because the cost of obeying the calendar is now higher than the cost of defying it. She said she and her team will try to manage it a little bit better, even though they're going to fine me by the end of the season, essentially admitting that the only way to survive is to budget for punishment as part of her scheduling strategy. When the #1 player starts treating WTA fines like a planned expense, you know the calendar rules have stopped functioning as guidelines and started functioning as coercion. The pressure doesn't land evenly across the sport. Elite male players on the ATP side have just secured a modest reduction in their mandatory load through negotiations and calendar tweaks, while the women's tour continues to lean on its biggest names. On the same day Sabalenka ripped the schedule, reports surfaced that the ATP had agreed to slight compromises on mandatory events for its top stars. The message, intentional or not, is that male champions can negotiate breathing room, while female champions are still expected to be road warriors for 11 months, carrying TV windows from January exhibitions to November finals. That imbalance feeds the perception that WTA player welfare is more slogan than policy. In this environment, every scheduling decision becomes a kind of tactical warfare. Skip Doha or Dubai, and you might preserve your shoulder, but you risk zeros in your rankings and losing a top seeding status that protects you from early round landmines. Show up to everything, and you might defend your points, but your body pays a compound interest rate that eventually comes due in the form of fatigue, injuries, or mental burnout. Sabalenka's 2025 season, where she said she played some events completely sick, is a case study of what happens when the fear of penalties overrides basic self-preservation. Swiatek's experiences make the trap even clearer. She's spoken about barely having a genuine offseason, starting one year's United Cup less than 2 months after finishing the WTA finals the previous November. She said playing for 11 months is too much, but the ranking race doesn't wait. If she reduces her schedule, she risks the same point penalties and 0-point insertions that hit her when Sabalenka eventually passed her for the top spot. The lawsuit argues that these structures don't just influence sporting outcomes, they also restrict the ability of players to accept other events or exhibitions that could ease their physical or financial stress. It's not just a crowded calendar, it's a locked one. From a rules perspective, the WTA can point to a clear structure. The 2026 rulebook spells out how many WTA 1000 mandatory events must be played, when long-term injuries can excuse an absence, and how zero-point penalties are applied. It cross-references integrity programs and player development obligations, and it presents the entire architecture as a professional framework for a global sport. But the lived reality for someone like Sabalenka looks very different. She sees a year in which the only way to keep her career alive long-term is to consciously violate the expectations baked into that framework and absorb the financial and ranking damage. The moment your number one player is scheduling around the punishment mechanism, the system has failed its own design brief. It is also important to recognize the psychological impact. When players know that any skip of a mandatory event will be tracked and punished, they are less likely to listen to their own bodies, trainers, or doctors. That erodes trust not only in the tour, but also in the idea that welfare is a shared priority. Sabalenka's comments about so many players getting injured were not rhetorical. They were a direct reference to a season in which the injury list at big events has become a recurring storyline, with both men and women arriving at majors taped up or pulling out altogether. If the WTA's enforcement tools are contributing to that, then the claim of player-first governance becomes difficult to defend. Meanwhile, the PTPA's case is forcing governing bodies to answer questions they have historically managed to avoid. The lawsuit frames penalties for missed events, including point deductions that reshuffle world number one positions, as part of an anti-competitive structure designed to keep players dependent on tour-sanctioned events and to crowd out rival tournament promoters. By linking schedule complaints like Swiatek's to concrete moments where ranking swings were tied to these mechanisms, the TPA is trying to turn what used to be locker room grumbling into evidence in a courtroom. Sabalenka's public stand slots perfectly into that narrative. A top player who is finally willing to say that the fines are coming and she will take them anyway. The most revealing part of this story might be what has not happened. Despite years of complaints from stars, from Swiatek calling the season crazy to Carlos Alcaraz raising similar concerns on the men's side, the core WTA commitment rules have continued into 2026 with only limited adjustments. There has been no major public overhaul of the women's mandatory structure in response to the suit or to high-profile player criticism. The ATP's modest compromise with its own stars only sharpens the contrast. When you compare timelines, the men are beginning to carve out escape hatches, while women like Sabalenka are still standing in front of microphones explaining why they will break the rules that are supposed to protect them. So where does this leave the WTA heading into the rest of 2026? The tour is marketing an 11-month product built heavily around a handful of elite women whose schedules are already stretched to breaking point. Its rulebook demands loyalty to an almost continuous circuit of Grand Slams, mandatory thousands, and commitment 500s. Its players are now openly calculating how many fines or zeros they can absorb in exchange for an extra week of rest. And its main rival in the courtroom, the PTPA, is arguing that these same rules are not just harsh, but unlawful. Sabalenka's January tirade is not an isolated meltdown. It is a flashing red light that exposes a system where player welfare is the slogan on the wall and punishment for self-preservation is the policy in the rulebook.